Also proportion in the natural world, as evidence of nature's massive shift to design. Using neural models, he began a meticulous study, understanding measurements of the human body through the movements of the limbs of different groups. The measurements of the human body vary in each limb according to how much it expands and from different views, so that they grow or diminish to a varying extent on one side, while they grow or diminish on the other side. Seeking inspiration, Leonardo studied the treatise by Vitruvius, a Roman architect of the 1st century BC, who wrote about the symmetry between the human body and a skillfully designed temple, and carefully measured the proportions of what he described as a well-shaped man.
And this was classical belief that the symmetry of proportion of the human body reflected as a microcosm of the greater harmony of the world.
Just as the human body yields a circular outline, so too a square figure may be found from it, wrote Vitruvius.
Uno dei casi più celebri di dialogo con l'antico e di tentativo anche di superamento dell'antico è sicuramente l'uomo vitruviano, parte dal testo scritto, dalla fonte antica, ma la rivede alla luce di quelle che sono le proprie indagini e il proprio rapporto con il dato naturale.
The space between the parting of the lips and the base of the nose is 1/7 of the face.
Leonardo is very, very scientific about it.
The space from the mouth to the bottom of the chin is
He does all sorts of measurements and treatments from the forehead to the nose, to the chin, to the navel, to the genitals of all of his assistants. So he gets all the proportions exactly right the way Vitruvius had suggested.
the distance from the top of the nose, where the eyebrows begin, to the bottom of the chin is 2/3 of the face.
L'uomo vitruviano è una figurazione astratta di un uomo ideale che non esiste in realtà, ma è la somma delle caratteristiche e delle proporzioni perfette, più armoniche.
Leonardo is interested in the human proportion, and he thinks that's divine enough to be represented. He says there is enough poetry and enough cosmos and enough infinite in another human being or a rock and a waterfall or a half smile.
Caterina came on the 16th day of July, 1493.
Cette Katharina, voilà, c'est un mystère, elle a disparu de l'histoire. Sauf que elle revient des années et des années plus tard, en tout cas son nom revient dans les carnets de Léonard, il y a une Katharina qui vient vivre au sud.
Since leaving Vinci decades earlier, Leonardo had rarely made any note of his mother, who by 1493 was in her mid-60s and widowed.
L'idée plaisante de Léonard, au sommet de sa gloire, recueillant sa vieille mère, on peut rêver sur les rapports qu'ils ont à cette époque-là, la fierté de la mère et la joie de Léonard de retrouver sa génitrice.
1 year later, on a page of his notebook, he recorded the costs of burying her. For the bier, 8 soldi. A pall for the bier, 12 soldi. For burying and placing the cross, 4 soldi. For 4 priests and 4 clerics, 20 soldi. For the grave diggers, 16 soldi. Sugar and candles, 12 soldi. Every evil leaves pain in our memory, except the supreme evil, death. which destroys this man along with our life. In November of 1493, Ludovico Sforza hosted a celebration for his niece Bianca, who was marrying the King of Germany. On display for the occasion was a colossal 20-foot-high clay horse sculpted by Leonardo. The model took part of a bronze monument honoring Il Moro's father. I'm certain that neither Greece nor Rome, one astonished witness said, ever saw anything more massive. The artist had studied live horses obsessively, measuring their proportions and drawing their features in his notebooks.
I think he was better at horses than anyone has ever been. He has the horse rearing, and then he has the neck and the head turned in 3 different ways, and there's so much motion. You see all the different possibilities, and you see how accurate he is with all of them, too.
Rather than cast the massive statue in the tried and tested way, divided into pieces, Leonardo planned to create one giant mold. When you shall have made the mold on the horse, you must make the thickness of the metal in clay. Dry it in layers. Make the outside mold of plaster to save time in drying and the expense in wood. And with this plaster, enclose the irons both outside and inside to a thickness of 2 fingers. Make terracotta. He planned to build a lattice metal frame to secure the mold before lowering it upside down into a pit, using a pulling machine of his own design. Finally, he would pour molten bronze through holes spread across the mold, using furnaces arrayed around the pit to cool the metal evenly. Ludovico Sforza gave him the 75 tons of bronze he needed. But in the fall of 1494, before Leonardo could put it to use, Sforza confiscated it all. The French king, Charles VIII, had ordered his troops south to conquer the kingdom of Naples, setting the entire Italian peninsula on edge. To preserve his control over Milan, Il Moro quickly aligned himself with Charles. At the same time, he sent the valuable medal to his father-in-law, the Duke of Ferrara, who feared a French invasion and planned to make cannons with Leonardo's bronze.
He couldn't have been human if he wasn't disappointed at losing this commission, which, had he been able to bring it to fruition, it really would have made his reputation. It would have been his work of fame.
Ludovico Sforza would soon assign a new project to Leonardo, a painting Leonardo believed few would ever see. In the early 1490s, Il Moro had chosen a monastery to serve as a mausoleum for his family. Home to an order of Dominican friars, the site featured a cloistered garden, quarters for the monks, a sacristy, and the recently completed Church of Santa Maria della Grazia. To adorn the south wall of the refectory, Sforza commissioned a fresco of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. For the north end, Leonardo was to paint a scene suitable for the monks who dined there in silent contemplation, the final meal Christ shared with his apostles before he was crucified, the Last Supper. It would be his most ambitious painting to date, featuring multiple figures engaged in a complex dynamic narrative on a physical scale much larger than any of his previous works, including the abandoned Adoration of the Magi.
It's a difficult subject for painters because it's a long, thin, wide picture which is slightly difficult to organise. And you want some drama, or Leonardo wanted drama in it.
For the most part, Last Supper paintings would be very sedate scenes. If you look at these paintings, Christ and the apostles ranged across the table, mostly in silence. eating, maybe one or two talking together, and they're very placid scenes.
Una dimensione molto grande, una scala molto grande, è sicuramente un'occasione di provare il proprio valore, la propria capacità come pittore, ma anche un'enorme sfida. Più grande è la composizione, più grande sono le figure, più gli errori sono visibili, dicono le fonti dell'epoca.
He bought a Bible, a widely read Italian language edition that had been translated from Latin 2 decades earlier. The Gospels, the books attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, offered varied but similar accounts of the evening on which Jesus gathered his 12 apostles, and during dinner, staggered them with the declaration, "He that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me."
It's an incredibly emotional moment where we have this charismatic religious leader with his band of brothers, and they're meeting in an occupied city whose authorities are plotting against them. And of course, sitting in their midst is a traitor, the one who's going to betray the leader. And I think Leonardo was probably electrified by this story. And he was going to tell it in a very dramatic, theatrical way, a way in which no artist previously had thought about, let alone attempted.
Leonardo began exploring how the disciples, foiled by Christ's words, would twist their limbs, wring their hands, and distort their faces.
One was drinking and has left the glass where it was and turned his head towards the speaker. Another, weaving the fingers of his hands together, turns frowning to his companion.
For Leonardo, he had to understand how the body worked as a responsive machine. What happens when Christ says, "One of you will betray me," with the brain and the nervous impulses and so on. He would see, if he was looking, say, at a disciple who reacts to Christ's pronouncement by, say, throwing out their arms. That figure is expressing the concetto dell'anima, the purpose of the mind, the purpose of the soul. It's a way of expressing character and expressing emotion.
Leonardo erected scaffolding along the north end of the refectory and began his mural. First, by coating the wall with a layer of plaster, then a binding agent, and on top of that, a primer of red white. He pounded nails into the plaster for reference and used a ruler to draw construction lines and a stylus to etch grids. Using the incisions, he laid out the scene's ceiling and walls, constructing the space with realistic scale and depth and geometric harmony. One nail hole at the very center would serve as the point at which all perspective lines would converge. It was where he would paint the face of Christ.
Filippo, Simone, Matteo, Tomè, Jacopo Maggiore.
He made sketches in chalk and used a brush to paint outlines directly atop the plaster.
Pietro, Andrea, Bartolomeo.
The moment you lay down the first mark or the first line, you're engaged in a process of evaluating every next step and understanding whether or not you have to make some major changes or some minor changes. This is what's going on all the way through the process.
Rather than follow the traditional technique for fresco, in which pigments ground in water are painted on wet plaster and bind to the wall in a matter of hours, Leonardo used a mixture of oil and tempera that he concocted himself.
This allowed him the luxury of painting during a long process of time. So he was not limited to 8 hours a day and just one part of the design. And it also, very importantly, allowed him to create the transitions of tone and the transitions of light because you could not get the effect of light with fresco.
In layer upon layer, he applied the pigments that would, over time, bring the scene to life, often disregarding his initial outlines as the contours of his design evolved. For Christ's garments, he used vermilion, a pigment made from a brick-red mineral called cinnabar, and ultramarine, created by crushing lapis lazuli, a costly but brilliant blue metamorphic rock that could only be found in Afghanistan. Often, he would not put down his brush from first light until nightfall, forgetting to eat and drink, wrote the novelist Matteo Bandero, who as a boy had watched as Leonardo toiled on the mural. On other days, he added little to the wall. Meanwhile, Sforza had grown impatient with Leonardo's unhurried pace and directed his secretary to draft a revised agreement that would impose a deadline on the artist. Within months, Leonardo was finished. The mural rose 15 feet from bottom to top and spanned 29 feet across the refectory's north wall. It showcased his gift for blending tones and colors, his mastery of light and shadow, and his command of geometry, which he wielded with great precision to bring harmony to a moment of chaos.
It's often said he's portraying a moment that looks like a kind of flash photograph of what's going on. Which is in a way, but it's more complicated than that. Because if you look in the picture, the main thing is that Christ saying, "Well, if you will betray me."
And now all saying is an I, is an I, is an I. And this central figure, totally focused on what's going to happen the next day and on the sign that he's giving of the offering of his body and blood. He gazes down in deep sadness. He doesn't look at the apostles.
And all the disciples react in a particular way, apart from Judas, who's rigid and his tendons in his neck stick out because he's aware of what's going to happen. The announcement of betrayal then ripples out.
Chacun réagit d'une façon extrêmement puissante. Tout panel des autres expressions qui sont ici représentées par Leonardo, c'est comme une onde de choc psychologique qui, face à laquelle réagissent les apôtres.
This was the heart of the painting for him because it allowed him to show gesture and action and facial expression, the motions of the mind. All of this 3-4 seconds that happens at this table is unfolding before our eyes in this single image. And the brilliance of him being able to bring this off is truly astounding.
Leonardo da Vinci had magnificently rendered the gestures, both subtle and dramatic, that testified to the psychological states of his subjects. And he had resoundingly answered the question that he had asked himself many times before. Tell me if anything was ever done.
For him, painting was an entire philosophical meditation. It is is so much a process of thinking, of engaging, of feeling that was essential in his creative process. And really, this is part of the reason that this painting has that transformative, transcendental aspect to it. When we go as viewers and look at it, we all fall into the same category.
The artist now turned his attention to other projects. He provided illustrations for De Divina Proporzione, a book on mathematics, by his friend Luca Pacioli.